Welcome to Command Control Power, a weekly podcast hosted by 3 certified members of the Apple Consultants Network, drawing from over half a century of combined experience. We talk shop, interview vendors and colleagues, and share what we've learned while operating our technology consulting practices. This is Joe Saponare of CyMac, and my 2 co-hosts are Jerry Zigmont of MacWorks and Sam Valencia of the HCS Technology Group. For the freshest content, a peek behind the scenes, and more candid conversation about running our businesses, dealing with clients, fixing tough technical issues, and everything else you love about Command Control Power, we invite you to join us on Patreon so you don't miss any of this great content. Go to commandcontrolpower.com and click support. Pledge monthly, and you can instantly subscribe to the weekly patron-only shows right in your favorite podcast app. Once again, to join us on Patreon and get the latest patron-only episodes, visit commandcontrolpower.com and click support. We hope to see you there, and thanks for listening. Command Control Power is brought to you commercial-free thanks to the support of our community. Our VIP supporters include Jason Detbarn of Adigy.com, Taylor Boyko of SimpleMDM.com, Collide.co, John Brown of GroveTech.co, Watchman Monitoring, and Adam Angst of Tidbits Content Network. Thanks very much for supporting the show. Welcome back to Command Control Power. We are very pleased this week to be joined by a special guest, Dave Hamilton of Mac Geek Gab. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I have listened to your show over the years, and I am stoked to be here.
We've listened to your show too, and I know Jerry oftentimes refers to it in the show or sends me and Sam different things he's learned over the years. So, you know, we've all been listeners of yours as well. So the feeling is mutual, and it's great to meet you on the air here.
Absolutely. Likewise.
So it's funny, we were just catching up, reminiscing about the old days and all the paths through life that we've taken. And it turns out that Dave's family and my family grew up basically seconds away from each other. So it's pretty
one
wild
street
connection.
Over.
Yeah. It's just, such a small world. What are the odds of that? And it got me thinking about just like the kind of origin stories. And I want to hear more about, what your shows are aside from Mac Geek Gab and kind of how you got into that. But it reminds me of, I grew up in Westport, Connecticut. We have a great high school there, great school system in general. And one of the things we had as a high school was a radio station. I got an FCC license for what was called college radio at the time because no high schools had a radio station. And I remember hearing it, driving around and hearing like good music and being like, what is this, before high school. And it was the local high school station. So I knew I was interested as I was going into high school. I never knew decades later that I have a podcast and actually, it's not like I have experience, from being on the radio. Back then we were playing our favorite music and ordering free pizzas and just being dumb high school kids on the air. I mean, look at that. I have this backstory of being on high school radio and here I am on a podcast. So what's your story, Dave, growing up in that area?
Well, first of all, I want to make the assumption that you went to Staples High School in Westport.
Correct.
Is that correct? Yeah. Okay.
Right.
So in addition to now I've learned Staples having a radio station, Staples also played home to concerts by The Doors, Cream, The Byrds, Peter Frampton, The Animals, The Rascals, Sly and the Family Stone. Like there were a lot of bands that played. I never saw any of those bands at Staples. I'm not that old. But yes, Staples was always on the cutting edge. That's really cool, man.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, really, really cool. And it's funny, like when you look back, even just to keep it relevant, Steve Jobs has a quote about being able to connect the dots when looking back. And, it's hard to do that when looking forward, of course. Like I never would have imagined that anything in high school would be relevant to the rest of my life, and a lot of things, of course, have been. Like I was into computers, that's what we said back then. You were into computers,
Same. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I don't want to say we were the outcast, but that might actually be correct. I don't know.
Yeah, totally.
We certainly weren't in the majority, right? And no one really understood how, of course, it's just a bunch of old guys talking now. Nobody really understood how important and how vital computers would be to our world. I mean, people might say, "Oh, the future's in computers," but I don't even know that those of us that were into it understood it. In fact, I remember the moment where I did understand it. And I was with John F. Braun, my now co-host for Mac Geek Gab. We did not have a podcast at this point in time, the story I'm telling. But we would get, he and I have known each other since I was 15 and he's a few years older than me. But we would just hang out and mess around with our Apple IIs because we were Apple II guys. And He had brought home a Mac from whatever co-op job he had while he was in college or something. And he showed me NCSA Mosaic, which was essentially the first web browser, right? We had been using the internet sort of. I would use FTP to get some files around. I would use news groups, various news groups to learn things like, about bands and tech stuff and all of that. We used some email, sort of. I don't even know if we were doing email over the internet at this point. I might have been using Gopher. But these are all the things that I've mentioned are things that probably don't mean anything to most people, might mean something to listeners here because we're a little geekier than average. But all of them were text-based things, right? And anytime someone asked me, hey, you understand the internet, show me the internet. And I would go with Gopher because at least Gopher was kind of like the web in that you had links and text. And so you'd like read an article and you could click a thing and go somewhere else. But it wasn't like the web at all, but that was the closest I could get, right? And I would show people that and they would walk away with this confused look on their face, like, why would anybody care about the internet? And it always frustrated me, right? That I couldn't show people what this thing really was. And John brought home this Mac with NCSA Mosaic, and he launched NCSA Mosaic. And the first time I saw it, it was like, oh, that's it. That's what this needs. This is it. If I showed people this, the light bulb would instantly go on for them. And I remember saying to John, this is what's going to change the world, man. Like, this is it right here. He's like, I don't know. It's not that much different than Gopher. I'm like, oh, no. Trust me on this. Of course, I didn't have any money in the game or anything, so it didn't really affect me other than it provided a huge path for me to create a living. So I guess in that sense, it massively affected me. But yeah, that moment of, oh, people are going to get it when they see this. It was when the web, and for obvious reasons, So
right, yeah. You showing people Gopher back in the day is like when people show me a meme today, and I'm like, I don't understand enough about pop culture. Like, I can't follow most of these things.
Yeah, maybe there's something to be said about that. Maybe there's a meme that we could create. If you understood Gopher, you don't understand memes. This is a Venn diagram that does not intersect.
It would just land for basically no one. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of, back in the day we called memes, that represented like a unit of idea or something. It wasn't like a graphic online, it was like a technical concept.
It was a theoretical concept, not like a thing that you could see, but
right.
Yeah.
That would be spread,
Kids ask your parents.
Twitter. Yeah, exactly. Right. The original meaning of meme.
Dave, I almost have a similar story. I went to a Mac users group in, I believe, Wethersfield back in the day. And I believe there was another program we would use before Mosaic, which was Anarchy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that was an FTP. It was like a visual FTP client, right?
Right. But for some reason, you needed that and you needed Gopher. I don't know why you needed both at the time.
You're right.
And then you would get a slip account if I'm...
Yeah. A slip account was the way that you could dial in and connect to the internet. Like it was a TCP IP connection over a dial-up connection, which seems so convoluted right now.
Right.
Am I remembering that right? Yeah. Okay.
I believe so. Yeah. And the other interesting thing, more connective tissue here, one of the supporters of the show, Adam Angst, the very first book I got to sort of learn how to use the internet was his Internet Starter Kit, which came with a CD where I could put on my Mac the TCP IP. What would you call it? I don't know what it was, but I needed something.
It was probably a desktop accessory or whatever they call it. That. Yeah.
And so Adam's been on the show. It's just interesting how never in my wildest dreams would I be thinking that I would be friendly with the author and I'd be doing this all these years later somehow. Yeah, it's crazy.
We ran Mac Observer we created it and ran it for 23 years until we sold it at the beginning of this year. There was a period of time where we decided, okay, we need to step up our game. We're starting to make a little bit of money. And we were able to hire Bob Levitas, Andy Anatko, and Ted Landau to write for us. And that was like the same kind of moment where it was like, oh, holy crap. Like these are the guys, like especially Ted Landau. Bob and Andy actually had bigger names at the time. But for me, Ted was the one because he ran MacFixit. And that was a site that meant a ton to me. When I was long before we ever started Mac Observer and certainly
all heavy hitters.
Yeah.
Heavy hitter, big time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
To
these
call
are
all three of them friends now it blows me away.
It's amazing. Yeah. The stewards of the Mac community, all the dark ages of Mac, when people just didn't even know what, most common people didn't know what a Mac was even. Like if you said a Mac, they vaguely understood it was a type of computer, but it was just really like rare enough in most circles where brand recognition for a while, and these were the people that were the leaders in the field when we were all kind of getting into it in those early days. That whole story about Mosaic, it sort of like reminds me of the killer app story, because it's like you have the infrastructure is there, the technology is there, but there's nothing that's compelling enough like intrinsically for people to really just like buy into it and want to get into it. But that's what did it. That's the thing that kind of was the turning point. And I try to think about like what's the version of that that's going to take over the world again. I mean, the most recent example we have is the iPhone. Prior to that, it was like broadly speaking, the personal computer. And I guess in the interim, it was the internet. Is there something new on the horizon? It's just so hard to imagine these things. I guess a lot of people think it's AR. A lot of people think it's NFTs or Web3. Are those the things to pay attention to, or do you have anything else kind of on your radar?
I've never been one of those people that can see around corners. That's not surprising to say because those people are few and far between. We could probably list most of the ones who have seen around corners, technologically speaking, very quickly here. There's Milo Medin, who created TCP/IP, and you mentioned Steve Jobs, and I don't know what's next. That's not my thing. I wish I could. It would make my financial life a whole lot simpler. But I still think. And I could be wrong. I'll preface this by saying I was the guy that the day the iPod was released thought, what a stupid idea. Why in the world would I want to have all my music in my pocket? Obviously, I was wrong. I know this now. Didn't take. In fact, it didn't take me very long to realize I was wrong. But I still think cryptocurrency has not found its killer app yet. And I think it's more than just a store of value, which is really what it is right now, right? There's no real transactions happening on it. We had this sort of blip with NFTs, and now, at least at this current moment, they are no longer in vogue. But that's kind of what happens with things is you get this little blip, and then you kind of have to trench in and figure out how to actually make these things work. Not everything can just be, you can't have a bubble that lasts, right? I mean, let's remember, in 2001, the internet bubble burst, right? The value of all these internet companies, I mean, it just went up like crazy. And we started Mac Observer in 1999 and then started BackBeat Media, which managed all the sponsorships, not just for Mac Observer, but a bunch of other websites, and now manages sponsorships for a bunch of other podcasts. We started those companies in 99 and 2000. We were making money hand over fist because we were internet companies and people were just fascinated with the internet and knew they needed to be there, right? And then the bubble burst in 2001 and the rates for ads got cut to 10% of what they were. But hold on for 20 years and hey, look, you can make a living. Right, doing the exact same thing. I mean, there's been some changes, obviously, but effectively, we do the exact same thing. And so, has the Bitcoin bubble burst? A few times, right? Did the NFT bubble burst? Very clearly, at least once. And it might burst a couple more times. But I think there's something to this. There's some fundamental flaws in like the monetary system, especially the world monetary system and the banking system, that I think are ripe for replacement. And so maybe that's the next thing, and the whole Web3 thing kind of dovetails into that. But I don't know. I mean, like I said, I'm the guy that thought the iPod was stupid.
Right. I think I'm a lot like you in that sense, in that I can't see around those corners. I can't see what's next on the horizon, and I don't foresee that future when people ask me those questions, even though I'm in the industry. So it's kind of funny to think about that. But it was also amusing to me as you're talking about when the bubble burst, because 2001 doesn't feel that far away for me. So I'm like, oh yeah, that was just a few years ago. And I mean, of course, now there are a ton of memes about that, but it just feels like a couple of years ago. No big deal.
My now adult son was not yet born at this point in 2001. So,
Exactly. My daughter's 18 and she was not around for this. So
I'm still reeling from Y2K. I mean, that one was the big deal when I was graduating high school. And then, a couple of years after that, I mean, we were already anticipating it at that point. Y2K was going to be this huge thing. That's
the whole two-digit numbers. Yeah.
Right.
That never, it was interesting. Obviously we were all worried about the power grid, right? On Y2K. That was the big concern. And I remember a moment, it was about 1 p.m. on January 1st of 2000 when the power went out, and my wife and I looked at each other and we're like, oh boy.
Is it happening?
Is it happening?
Yeah.
And then 30 seconds later, it came back on. And that was the last time I worried about Y2K.
Right. Wow.
I think you're right, though, Dave, going back to Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. I think, if you look at the big picture and you use the old phrase, follow the money, I think you're right. There's probably going to be something there. And it reminds me, back in the 80s, I went to a talk that Nicholas Negroponte gave at University of Hartford. And was associated with Draper Labs and MIT think tanks. And he was there specifically to talk about his book. I think it was called Being Digital, right? That just came to me. But basically, the gist of his whole hour-and-a-half speech was, forget about anything you know about the internet. Everything is going to be driven by commerce. It's all about commerce. And that's it. And it was sort of like a mic drop.
What year was this?
I think this was like 85 or 86.
Wow.
When we started, I don't want to say when we started Mac Observer, but certainly a couple of years before that, the whole idea of commerce on the internet was foolish. It was like, no. Like, that's not what the internet's for. We go to stores and we want to spend money. The internet's for this open, free exchange of information.
Right.
Like I said, I'm the guy that thought the iPod was stupid. And so the same thing applies. Like, I just couldn't see it. When now, connecting the dots going backwards, it's so obvious.
Right. Well, I mean, you can say this about almost anything because our entire society is based around commerce. It kind of makes sense that, like, for something to be successful, it better help with commerce, let you do more commerce, make more money doing commerce. Like,
friction.
if it yeah, less friction. Exactly. And so if Bitcoin finds that killer app that's not drugs and guns, then, it probably will become popular.
I don't know. VHS came into play with porn. So, I mean, drugs and guns aren't that far off. Like, these are things that people will buy in recessions, right? Like, for 1,000, right, Alex?
Right.
I mean, I follow those things and you will find the future.
Yeah, so those are usually the things that work initially. And then, because with Bitcoin, the dark web, that's people shop with, in theory, anonymous cryptocurrency, which then, of course, turns out to not be so anonymous.
Not nearly as anonymous as people thought. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, right. But, eventually, if it becomes just easier to use and I guess, and has some advantages over like a credit card or Apple Pay or whatever, then sure, that'll be another inflection point for that industry at some point. To your point earlier, like, it could take 5 or 10 more years or more, before the real money is to be made. And so in the meantime, everybody's just speculating. And that's what venture capital does. It creates it inflates the bubbles. And then, some people make some money and other people are still around when the bubble pops and get hurt. So it's kind of a natural cycle in our society. Not great, but there it is.
And I have a correction. I was a decade off on my book because Being Digital was published in 95. So it had to be. I
figured it was 96 that you saw, not 86.
Yeah.
Your years are mushing together, Jerry. That's what's happening here.
I know. Well, I'm on the back 9 right now, Sam. So
old guys talking tech chat. Here we are.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I know obviously many of our listeners know about Mac Geek Gab. So, and I do want to get into that podcast as well because I have some questions, but you do a lot of other stuff. So I'd like to kind of dive into all your, what you have your hands in these days.
My portfolio of life. Sure. Yeah. So everything that I currently do, I can sort of trace back to the Mac Observer, right? So in 99, as I mentioned, we started the Mac Observer and then we sold that in 23. But about about 8 months in, we had just made our first full-time hire, and that was a full-time sales rep because I realized Brian Chaffin and I started the Mac Observer. Brian, we as business partners often do, we kind of took the responsibilities and divvied them up. Brian was by and large in charge of the content. I was by and large in charge of everything it took to make the content. So that meant the tech stuff, because I was good at that, and finding money for the show or for the website. And so I realized very quickly that sales is a job rooted in negativity, right? If you make 20 phone calls and you get 19 no's, that's a successful day.
Yeah.
Right. Well, compare that to, I can sit down and code something for the website and spend the same time doing that. And that feels productive all the way through. I don't have to have anybody telling me no. And so I realized sales needed to be a full-time job, and I either needed to hire a programmer or a salesperson. And since I could hire a salesperson on full commission, that was the decision that was made. And immediately things turned around for us, or sort of propelled forward for us. There was no real turnaround. We had started from zero. So, it didn't go, we weren't going negative, but we needed to go positive a whole lot faster. And about a month after we hired our sales rep, we had 4 of our competitors, competitive websites to us, come to us and say, hey, will you do for us what you've done for you? We just want to publish our websites. We don't want to worry about sales. We also don't want to worry about hosting, because this was, 23 or 24 years ago. There was no DreamHost or any of that going on. And so that's where the company BackBeat Media started. And if I had to pick something as my current day job, it would be that. It would be BackBeat Media. We still represent sponsorships for some websites and a bunch of podcasts, both in and out of the tech world. And then about 7 years into this whole Mac Observer thing, the podcasting bug had started to grow. And so in 2005, I decided we needed a podcast at the Mac Observer. And like everything we've done there, the idea was, okay, I'll start it and get it rolling and then hand it off to someone else. You already know the end of this story. I failed at the second part of that, and I'll explain why. So we started the show, and this was 3 weeks before we knew the iTunes store, now Apple Podcasts, was going to launch its podcast directory. Steve Jobs had been on stage in March of that year saying, we're adding a podcast directory to iTunes. It's coming in June. We started the show in mid-June, and the podcast directory was coming a couple weeks later. So we got the show launched. It was like, okay, this is great. But I wanted to make sure we were going to be in this iTunes directory. So I started calling the contacts that we had at Apple. And this was when Steve Jobs was running things there. And of course, everybody was like, well, it's not me that's running the directory. And I don't want to make any introductions because I don't want to get fired for telling you the wrong thing because you're the press and this, that, and the other thing. And that conversation repeated itself like 5 or 6 times over until finally I had exhausted everybody that I knew at Apple. And I was just frustrated one day. I was like, this is freaking stupid. Like, why? What a stupid way to run a company. Your CEO was on stage excited about this thing. And I have a thing that fits perfectly into this, right? So why is this happening? What a dumb way to run a company. And so I thought, yeah, that is a dumb way to run a company. I'm going to just write to the CEO. So I wrote Steve. I didn't tell him I thought his company was dumb, by the way.
Probably not a good way to start. Yeah.
Yeah. Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I don't think that's one of the first 3 lessons in the book. So I just emailed Steve and I was like, hey, I know you've got your podcast directory coming. We've got a show. I just want to make sure it's in it. 20 minutes later, my phone rings. It's, hey, this is Keith at Apple. We got your email. I mean, I know how you got it. Steve forwarded it to you. We got your email. I just wanted to make sure you knew that you were already in the directory. We already had you, but we took a second look at the show. We're going to feature you on day 1 and this, that, and the other thing. Like, oh, this is amazing. Yeah. So we went from having 1,000 listeners only because we shoved the show into the Mac Observer RSS feed. And back in those days, RSS was sort of the primary way that people nerds aggregated their web news. And so now they were just being forced to download this podcast. So to say we had 1,000 listeners is probably a stretch, but that's what the download showed. So, at the time, okay, great. And then the iTunes directory launched with us being featured, and we suddenly were at like 25,000 listeners. And then it was like, oh, crap, I'm the host. Great. Okay.
I've created a monster.
Yeah. And that was it. And so I've been doing it ever since. Now, I say, oh, crap. I say my plan failed. Of all the things, and I lead a charmed life. I love pretty much everything I do. There are moments that feel like work, as they should. But by and large, I really do. I get to do things that I enjoy. But doing Mac Geek Gab is, at the top of that list. I really enjoy, it was the third episode where we could not come up with a topic. And so I faked, I don't know, 5 or 6 questions that I said were listener mail. They weren't. They were questions that I made up. And then we answered. Yeah. And that was it. That was the last time I had to fake a question for Mac Geek Gab. From that point forward, people started sending their questions in. It fits. I've always had some form of a consulting business where I help people solve their tech problems. And so to have this show where I get to do that every week, I love helping people. I love learning new things. We say at the beginning of the show, the goal is to learn 5 new things every time we get together. I say that's primarily about me. I want to learn 5 new things every week, and I want to help our listeners do that too. So
well, I know this because I'm a devoted listener, Dave. I actually went back in my email, and I've sent you a few messages over the years, and I looked at one, and I found one that was from, I think, 2011. So I go back at least that far. But I remember the days when you would be complaining about your Palm Trio. So that's, it's
wow.
It goes back a ways.
Yeah.
Please share with our listeners that you actually come from a technical background. It's not like you're just a media guy. You did tech support in Texas, right?
Yeah, I'm a nerd first, for sure. Yeah. The whole media thing was just because I went to college long enough to learn how to write in a way that could communicate to people. But I also learned how to communicate nerd stuff to people, and that came long before the podcast. You're right. When I moved even when I was a kid, when people asked, what do you want to do for a living? My answer was, I want to be a computer consultant. That was a job that barely existed I don't think it did exist when I was a kid. But, I would break things on my Apple IIc, and I had to fix them myself because there was no one to call. And I thought, well, I'm pretty good at figuring this out. You sort of learn bullheaded persistence when, well, A, there's no one to call, and B, we really wouldn't have had the money to call somebody anyway. And C, my parents didn't see this computer as a thing that was sort of integral to our lives, so they probably wouldn't have spent any money on fixing it, right? I mean, they would have spent money supporting me in fixing it, but not on someone else, right? They're like, well, you figure it out. So I did. I learned how to figure it out, and then I would help friends and friends of the family usually, because my parents were like, oh, Dave can help you with your computer. It's like, yeah, sure, okay, sounds good. And then when I moved to Austin, I found a company called Computer Nerds with a Z. They had started in San Antonio. They just moved to Austin, and they were looking for nerds. And so I joined that company and became a junior partner in that company for a while, until my business partner, and I realized we were much better friends than business partners. And so he bought me out. But yeah, I was, Computer Nerds was like pre-Geek Squad. We would go to people's homes and offices and just fix their problems. And Austin was a great place for it because there was plenty of people, plenty of businesses, but advertising in that market was affordable for a small business, whereas in, say, New York, you couldn't advertising on TV in New York is impossible because New York is, serving the entire Eastern Seaboard, whereas Austin serves Austin. So we even bought some TV ads and did all of that stuff. And I learned a ton about business and all of those things, mostly by making awful mistakes and spending money. I call that my tuition.
And was that still in the PowerPC days?
So that's a really interesting question. That was pre and during PowerPC days. Yeah, when I got to Austin, we started that business. The PowerPC had not quite hit. Wow. And then I remember, because Power Computing, which was the first licensee of Apple clones, was in Austin. And so I actually got to meet with them. So I guess, the PowerPC on the Apple side existed at that point. It must. Yeah, it definitely did. Because I moved to Austin in 95, and I think the PowerPC came to Apple in like, I want to say 93, 94. But yeah, I got to meet with the people at Power Computing, and actually wound up with one of the first 100 Power 100s out of the gate from them, and it was terrible. It didn't work. They had to replace all the parts in it over time. There were heat issues. I mean, it was one of the first 100 computers this company ever built. So obviously there was problems. I met Bob Vitus there.
Oh, nice. That was probably during the time when I think Steve Jobs was away from Apple before he came back. Because didn't he like kind of kill off the whole clone business at that time?
That's true. Yeah. Steve was not with Apple then. Yeah. Steve came back to Apple right as we started the Mac Observer. It was right kind of in that time frame, beginning of 99 or end of 99, I think beginning of 2000 was when Steve came back to Apple.
The Gil Amelio glory days.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know who calls him that, but yeah, that's right.
Glory days. Yeah. I wonder how many of our listeners have any reference for half of the things we're talking about in the kind of deep history of Apple. But
that's
deep.
Just,
yeah,
I'm taking notes right now.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to do this again where we actually talk about like relevant tech stuff. So yeah.
Right. Current tech stuff. Yeah. Well, I mean, David, clearly shows, your deep pedigree in the tech world. There's obviously a lot of podcasts out there and including some tech podcasts where, the hosts are not necessarily as well versed in the technology. And clearly your show is one of those shows where you are very well versed. And not to mention you have people sending you, tips from all over the place and kind of crowdsourcing a lot of good information for people. On that topic, I wanted to share a quick tip of my own that I prepared for the show.
Amazing.
In the spirit of the quick tips on your show, this was a scratch your own itch kind of thing. Oftentimes at night with my iPhone, the brightness just seems too bright to me. I think I have just like extra sensitive eyes, and especially when I've been on a screen all day, like a lot of us are. Sure. At night, I might still want to use my iPhone for some other types of work or just reading or watching videos or whatever. But the screen just seems a little bit bright, even at the lowest setting. So this is with my iPhone 13 Pro. At the minimum brightness, it was still too bright for me sometimes. And this might be kind of an edge case. Probably not a lot of people feel that way. In fact, my wife will hand me her phone sometimes to show me something on her phone, and I just can't believe how bright it is. It's like blinding to me. So everybody's different. But I went looking for a solution to this, and of course, I started with the place where you find a lot of these little settings. Can anyone guess where this might be?
Are you looking in accessibility? Yeah.
Of course. Accessibility under vision, display, and text size. There's an option there, reduce white point. So I simply turned that on, and I was amazed at how much dimmer my screen got. And then I could actually dial that back a little bit to, I don't want as much dimming essentially, but right there in accessibility, vision, display, and text size, you can say reduce white point, and then you have a little slider to adjust that further. And I have mine set around 55%, and it immediately relaxed my eyes at night. And it's sometimes a little bit dim at certain times, but I can always increase the brightness using the standard control. So there you go. Quick tip.
Amazing. Is there a way to put that reduce white point into Control Center?
I haven't looked for that. That's a good question, but my feeling was now that I have that option enabled and I have it reduced like as much as I might want to reduce it, I can always now increase the main brightness control in Control Center. So I still have plenty of range, essentially.
Fair. There might be a way to do this, right? Like if you add an accessibility shortcut for that. That's a great tip. I like that. If we wind up sharing that on the show, I'll obviously credit you because that's awesome. What we do. We are but stewards on Mac Geek most of the time, right? People send stuff in. It took me a little while to realize that the show actually isn't about us. It's about our listeners and either what they need or what they know. And a few times we're just joining in as one of the listeners with a tip of our own. But most of the time we're just stewards and kind of passing things along. And it's great. Yeah.
Do you get anybody kind of like over contributing, where like the same person tends to just be constantly contributing? Because it just reminded me of this recent John Oliver clip. I don't know if you've watched his show Last Week Tonight, but he had this segment recently where he played this clip of a guy who calls into C-SPAN over and over and over again. It's like the same guy. And it's just kind of funny when you watch a montage of the same person, like calling in about all these different issues. And it makes you realize, like, probably the audience of C-SPAN is, similar to our podcast, actually. not huge.
Of course we do. If I look over the 17 plus years we've been doing the show, those people burn out. All the listeners burn out. Like it's just a thing. I know there are some who consistently, they start listening and they have yet to stop, right? And that's humbling and amazing. However, most people's lives have little twists and turns in them that change our schedules and change our available time for, say, commuting or whenever it was you might be listening, and things stop. Habits change. And so what's happened over the years is we'll get those people and then I won't hear from them for 5 years. And then suddenly they come back and it's like, oh yeah, I had whatever and I hadn't listened and now I'm back and the tips resume. But in their absence, there's been 3 other people that have come and gone, with the flurry of questions and tips. And it's fine. We are, I'll say, fortunate, and I actually mean that. We're fortunate enough that we have every week, there are so many tips and questions that come in that we couldn't possibly include them all in the show. So we really have the ability to craft a show from the questions that we want. Years ago, I came up with what I call the 20% rule, where I have to feel like the thing that we're going to talk about is going to apply to at least 20% of the audience. Not everybody has an Apple Watch. Not everybody has an iPhone. Not everybody has a Mac even. And so it can't be 100% of the audience. It can't even be 80% of the audience, but it's got to be 20%. And oftentimes I'll get the secret, and it's not really all that much, it's an open secret, is that our goal is to answer, at least privately, every single question and every query that comes in.
Wow.
And oftentimes I will start answering one knowing that it's way too niche for the show. It's like this one person has this super specific setup, and there's no way that anything from this is going to be relevant enough to make it to the show. And it's fine. I head down the path, I answer the question. And oftentimes, by the time I get to the end of the answer, I realize, wait. If I approach it from this angle, then it's hugely valuable to the show. And then sometimes I'll get a note from someone after we put it in the show. It's like, you kind of changed what I had asked, and it's different. It's like, yeah, that correct.
Artistic license, right?
Yeah, artistic license. Yeah, well, exactly. It's like I have to make this interesting to other people that are different from you. I try, like I said, via email, answering their very specific question, but then I sort of zoom out and shift it to be something that's relevant, because there's, we talk a lot on the show about the troubleshooting mindset and the idea of, stepping through things, changing one variable test, that whole idea of understanding what you're doing and why it matters and how you might solve problems. And there's often something like that in even the most unique scenario. So, and I did it. I actually put a qualifier in front of the word unique, which should never happen. It is a binary term. It's either unique.
I love it when people actually say that. That's great.
Right.
Well,
yeah,
I
said most uniques, and so I got to own that now. And
it's on you, man.
Yeah. Well, Dave, I think the breadth of information that you've put out is truly remarkable, and I just want to speak to that a little bit. You're on your 941st show, which is absolutely mind-blowing to me. And that not only shows dedication, but like you had said earlier, the love of what you do. But for anyone who's listening to this podcast, I mean, I have been since day one, even before I had a business, I had been a devoted listener. And what I really appreciate about your show is you don't dumb it down. So you don't softball it and make it for the average. There's a lot of information that's for the average Mac user out there, but there's a lot of truly unique technical information that you come up with on a weekly basis. And to give an example, one of the things that you had mentioned recently on a show was tailed scale. And if you don't know what this is the ability to basically take a remote drive that could be on your NAS in your office and make it available locally on your computer wherever you are in the world. the amount of information that you put out there, and a lot of it not only speaks to my clients, but speaks to me as well. And so thank you for all that.
Well, you're welcome. And thank you for saying what you said. Yeah, you're right. 941 episodes. Well, it certainly is a commitment, and it might make me committable. But yeah, it like I said, we enjoy it. Tailscale, when we found that, and again, that came from a listener, but that blew my mind. The way that works, explaining that is super difficult.
Exactly.
But effectively, it's like you have your own local network of your computers, no matter where those computers are. They're always on a network together, and it sort of transcends the internet, right? I mean, I don't know of a more efficient way to say that, but
Right.
still, it's one of those things that until you find your use case for it, you won't. I use it all the time when I need to SSH into terminal into one of my computers, and I can just do it without creating a VPN, without doing anything. I just can. It's just like I'm home. It's amazing. Yeah.
It's really I think you're pointing to that skill, that also Jerry's referring to, of just being able to speak to an audience, being able to like take a suggestion that might seem kind of arcane, but to, help people understand where they might be able to use it. That kind of thing can sort of lodge in your brain. And when you might have a use case down the road, you might think there was a thing I remember hearing on Mac Geek Gab about this, and then you might go looking for it, or that might ring a bell. And I think that's a really valuable thing. And just broadly, what you do is a certain type of curation, like you're crowdsourcing tips and tricks and information, but you're curating the kind of presentation of that information to help people understand how it could benefit them. And, how you can speak more broadly than just this one edge case. You might be able to speak to how that applies to more scenarios than just this one person's obscure, situation. It is a great skill to have. And I wish there were more of that on the internet. I think that there's a real need to be able to just distill information into understandable chunks for people and curate that information so that they can have access to the best info in a really simplified way. And that's not something that, computers do all that well just yet. I think probably AI will add to that. But, your skills over the last 900 something episodes have really been honed around that. And I think all of our listeners would certainly benefit. And I think it's also a great resource for our listeners' clients. So people that are doing technology consulting like we are, oftentimes get a request for maybe a show that they could listen to learn a little bit more. We don't like to pass along our show because sometimes we talk about our clients. That's also secret. So we will recommend your show.
Never.
So we'll recommend Mac Geek Gab. And, I don't even mention to my clients that I have a podcast because I don't necessarily want them to go looking for it. So you offer a great resource that's, I think, not only good for, the more technical among us, but also possibly good for the wide audience of our clients and so on.
Well, that's where we try to hit. And your comment that we are curators is right on the money. That's what I see my job as every week. I mean, I have multiple jobs when it comes to Mac Geek Gab. One is just the grunt of answering the questions. And I don't mean to be dismissive of that. Some of these questions are really hard to answer. But, then when it comes time to prep the show, I take on the role of curator. And it's like, okay, yeah, I may have spent a ton of time answering Tim's question, but that's not going to be helpful to other people. It was super helpful to Tim, and I'm glad I helped him. But that's sort of the end of that. That's where that one lives and breathes. But curating that stuff so that it's relevant. And I know we have a segment of our audience that's like you guys, which are consultants who are helping multiple people. And so it's like, okay, well, we need to serve that portion. But then we also need to serve the portion that is your clients or the people who aren't yet your clients, right? And so it's always keeping that in mind. And, we record our show live. Very rarely do I do any audio edits. And that comes from, I'm a musician, I'm a drummer. The part of me playing music that I love the most is being on stage in those moments where there's a crowd right there. Everything that happens is experienced by both the band and the crowd, the good, the bad, everything else. And I definitely apply that to Mac Geek Gab. I think of our agenda as a set list. If it makes sense to start changing things around halfway through the show because of the way the show's going, great, we will do that. But it's very much that sort of live without a net thing. And I love that challenge every week. That's a big part of it for me. But again, with the focus being, people really do, like I said, we say at the beginning of the show, everybody here, the goal is for us all to learn 5 new things. And I mean that. I really want everybody to learn every time we get together. And so that's the responsibility part of it. And then there's the fun of doing it live and making sure that still happens and having some fun with it along the way. So.
Well, yeah, I think our listeners have learned at least 5 new things from 1990 and that era. So I think we've achieved our goal in a certain way.
Going into it, I was just thinking about those 5 new things as well, because I think there was something on a recent episode where we were talking about option and then control clicking on a file and getting the full path name. And I only recently learned that right before your show. So I'll admit it wasn't from the show, but
sure.
When I learned it, I was like, whoa, like that just blew me away, because sometimes you need to paste that into, terminal or something like that. And it just does the trick for you. Then you go on to other topics as well. I mean, you were talking, I think on the one that was just released today, 941, you were talking about HDMI. And I was like, you said something as simple as like replace your cables, because a listener had mentioned that. I was like, oh my God, this could be the source of all my main TV issues, because I've had the same HDMI cable in the wall for like 13 years.
Yeah, that cable is definitely not doing what it needs to do. Like, there's no way that it could be. The specs that your TV adheres to did not exist when that cable was put in the wall. Right?
Yeah, so I think it's a high time I probably replaced mine, but
I replaced
funny.
all of mine. I think I said it in the show that they arrived like while we were recording, and only because I had access to the listener's comment, 4 days before we recorded. And as soon as it came in, it was like, oh, duh. Of course.
Exactly.
We see that with networking too. Like, client will say like, we have Cat 5 in all the rooms and this and that. And it's like, Cat 5, I mean, when was that installed? Well, we moved about 15 years ago. I think it was there at the time. So it's like, okay, yeah, that we're not using that wiring. That's like, we don't trust it anymore, and
we don't trust it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that is a good general tip. It's something as simple as like, check the cables, replace the cables.
Yeah. So basic, but like the things you don't exactly think about. You look for the hard stuff. You go for the hard stuff. But
well, that's our problem as nerds, right? We're always looking for, okay, it can't be anything simple. So let's jump to the hard stuff. And honestly, that's one of the things I really love about doing Mac Geek Gab is it reminds me daily of the simple stuff that makes more of a difference than the hard stuff, or at least makes a more frequent difference than the hard stuff. The hard stuff, when it matters, boy, howdy, it matters, right? But most of the time, it's the simple things. Like, is it plugged in? Do you have it? Like, I mean, how often has when I was doing a lot of on-site consulting at homes, and I'm sure you guys can relate. Like, I can't tell you how many times I showed up and it was like, oh, well, they're like, oh, my sound card stopped working and I don't get any sound out of my speakers. And I was like, well, hang on. Yep. Does that fix it? Yeah. Okay. Well, it just needed to be plugged in, and then there's this huge moment of embarrassment. Like, please don't tell anybody my name. It's like, okay, yeah, no problem. Like, yeah, it's fine. Just write the check there and we're good to go. I'm going to head out. Those things are common because they're common. The simple answers are often the answers. And it's super easy for us as nerds to overlook 100% of those and just dive deep when really we shouldn't. And honestly, I think that's a lot of what the folks in your roles, the consultants who listen to Mac Geek Gab, get out of the show is the reminders of, oh yeah, we're all going through this together. And the simple things are more frequently the problem than something that's sinister and complex. Not to say that we don't love the sinister, complex stuff, because that's fun at least when you're on the other side of it, once you get to the end.
Yeah. Well, the simple stuff can be kind of equally challenging in a different way. And even sometimes there's subtlety to that too. Like, I had a member of my team on site a few years ago installing a network in New York City, and which is a little bit outside of our kind of day-to-day coverage area. And, they were kind of struggling. It was like a Saturday. And so I got involved and tried to give them some guidance. And I said, did you restart the thing? It was like a piece of Unify equipment. And they're like, of course, yeah, we unplugged it multiple times, this and that. And I said, well, how long did you leave it unplugged? I don't know, a few seconds. I said, well, unplug it for like 2 minutes and let's just see if that helps. And you know what? That solved it. So it's not like why I get paid the big bucks, as the saying goes, but it's sort of like sometimes you just have to ask the really stupid, simple questions.
Oh, I don't know. I think that is why you get paid the big bucks. I have a friend, and I only have one friend who's like this, who is literally a billionaire. He's been the CEO of the same company actually, he finally was able to retire, but the company was sold 5 times while he was CEO. And he would tell me about like the things that he would do to propel the company forward. And 99% of them were asking the simple questions that the people who were paid lots of money to do their jobs would overlook. It's like, well, I'm paid a lot of money. I got to look at the complex stuff. It's like Ken would always ask, like, well, did you try it this way? Well, no, not yet. Okay, yeah. Well, try that. It's like, there's the solution. All right, well,
the real skill.
I think that is why you get paid the big bucks, is that you're willing to look at the simple answers. Yeah.
Yeah. You have to be able to zoom out far enough and you have to be able to zoom in far enough, equally well.
You have to know when it's time to do either, right? Like, I think that's where experience comes in. I do another podcast that used to be called The Small Business Show, now is called Business Brain, for exactly this reason, because we started talking about that we had always talked about that kind of stuff. And that is using our business brains, right? And they apply all the time, not just when we're doing like, business spreadsheets and stuff. It's this kind of thing. Like, oh, no, this is one of those times where I need to zoom out. Leave it unplugged for 2 minutes instead of 2 seconds. And with Unify gear, as soon as you said it was Unify gear, it was like, oh no, you can't. You've got to leave that unplugged for a while. That stuff or whatever, like that stuff's weird. You got to,
But for whatever reason,
for whatever, it doesn't matter the reason. And that's the thing where I'll say a junior level tech will get bogged down in, well, why is it that way? It's like, look, it in this particular moment, it doesn't matter why. We just know it is, and so. Accept it.
And it's not about trying the same thing. Like, I don't care if you've unplugged it 10 times, but for 2 seconds each time. That's just trying the same thing over and over. What I'm saying is
insanity.
Exactly. Try the same thing, but do it a little bit differently. Wait longer in between. Sometimes with an iMac, wait an hour. Like, leave it unplugged for an hour. That resets the SMC in certain models. I mean, there's just different little things like that where it's like, well, I already tried that, but you didn't try it exactly following my instructions.
Are you saying that our clients that hard restart their computers 9 or 10 times in a row should keep going until
keep going? Just wait longer each time. Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. There's lots of times where I wish you wouldn't have tried that 50 different ways, just like call me in the first case. But, but they'll say to me like, well, I already restarted the printer. All right, but I'm going to walk you through this a certain way. This is the magic special sauce. It's like, turn it off using the button, but then also, wait for it to turn off, then unplug it from power for 2 minutes, then plug it back in, then turn it back on. Let's see if that works. And like 90% of the time that works.
It seems pedantic, but it's like, no, trust me on this. Like, this is why you're paying me. I have experience here. Do the thing. Yeah.
Like, this shouldn't work. I wish it didn't work like this. I wish technology worked better and more consistently, but like, this is the way it is. And I'm telling you, I've had lots of cases where this works. It works often enough where this is still something we try. And it solved your problem. You're welcome.
It's funny, as you're telling the story, I remember being with one client, and I honestly don't remember what the problem was, but I had spent like 3 hours solving this problem. And for any of the consultants out there, if you've been doing this longer than a year, you already know this. But my whole thing was I would make sure to keep the client informed throughout the process of what I was doing. And when possible, engage them in decisions like, well, we've tried A, B, and C. Now we can try D or E. Here's why I think we should try E next, but what do you think? And, engaging them. The only reason I ever did, well, there were 2 reasons I did that. One, talking it out often, trying to explain it to someone else often gave me the answer. And then the more important reason was it kept the client engaged. And so they would pay me for all the hours that I was spending there because they would see that I was spending time. And so, I did all of the right things. I was experienced enough to do all that. And I get to the end and we finally solved the problem. And I'm like, oh man, it was this one thing. And the guy looked at me and he's like, so I'm going to pay you for 3 hours of doing this. And he's like, I don't have any problem with that. That's fine. But just to say it out loud, the next time you see this problem, you're going to be able to solve this in 5 minutes, aren't you?
Interesting.
And I said, that's correct. Yeah. I said, today, this is where you wound up. You wound up on this side of it. But the next time you call me, it might be for something that I've spent 3 hours troubleshooting first for someone else, and I know the answer for you in 15 minutes. It's just how it goes. And he's like, no, I get that. He's like, that's fine. He's like, you obviously were doing all the right things, and it's just how it works. He's like, I had a relatively rare problem, and so that's just how it's going to be. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. But there are those things where you spend the time, hopefully on the clock, where you get to learn, and then you move on. And
okay,
yeah, we've all been there.
Yeah, I want clients like yours, buddy. The ones that are like, okay, it took you 3 hours for a quick thing. I'm okay with that.
Right.
Well, you can make them okay with that, right? Like that's the key. And when we ran Computer Nerds down in Austin, that was a lot of what we had to teach our nerds. They came in knowing the tech stuff, but it was like, man, you need to get paid. You are there for your expertise. We are not selling solutions. We are selling expertise. And there are some problems that are unsolvable, and you still need to get paid. And so you need to engage the clients. You need to make them feel like and understand that you are providing a service for all of the minutes that you're there, not just the final minute when you tell them your problem is unsolvable. You need a new computer or whatever, whatever the outcome might be. Like anything, teaching makes you better at things too. It makes you understand it better. And it made me a better consultant, teaching other people how to be better consultants. And so there you go. But that's, like you said, to me, that's the key. Check in with the client once every 20 minutes, no matter what.
I think that is a key. And some clients will tell you, do I need to know this? It's like, or like, I don't need to know all these things. Just, you're the expert. You can solve it. I mean, most clients are not quite that flippant about it, but some of them will
some are.
give you that feedback. Yeah. And that's fine. But I tend to use the same process of like talking it out with the client so that they know that they're involved in it. And, they can help make those decisions sometimes. Like where I say, if I knew like this folder wasn't that important, actually, then, we would proceed in this direction. But if this is critical and you definitely need I want that data. Okay, then I'm going to continue this harder road here, try and fix this underlying issue or whatever. But that's a really interesting feedback from a client too. I don't know that anybody's had that same kind of level of observation where they're saying, next time this is going to be much more efficient, right? And that guy is going to be happy with the outcome, much happier than I am. It's an interesting dichotomy, but as you put it, the next time they might be on the other side of that and getting more for less. But by the same token, I think also your rate could go up by then. It's like that's
true.
Kind of why we charge for expertise, why we charge for more money as time goes on, not only because of inflation or whatever, but just because as we get more efficient, if we're charging hourly, we by definition need to charge more because we're delivering the same outcome in less time. I mean, we shouldn't be making less money for doing it. So
no. And one thing that I found really helpful, well, I mean, it comes from another sort of thing I used to teach, is this isn't your computer, it's your client's computer. So they need to be involved in any decisions that are going to change how their computer works. And you can advise them to do how you would do it if it were your computer, but then they need to make the decision. And whatever decision they make is the one that you need to act upon, right? I took that and applied it to the troubleshooting process too. When I would get to a fork in the road where it was like, well, I can take path A or path B, and I don't really know which one is going to be the faster path to a solution, I would engage the client and tell them, okay, here's where we are. Here's what I've done. Here's path A. Here's path B. If it were my computer, I would take path A but it's not my computer. It's your computer, and it's your money that's paying for my time. So which way would you like me to go? And 9 times out of 10, they'd say, well, I trust you. Go with path A if that's the path you would take if it was your computer. But sometimes they'd say, no, take path B. That's a more predictable outcome of, expenses or whatever it is. And it's like, okay, that's fine. No problem. Take that path. It's not my computer. It's yours. Yeah.
You mentioned trust, and I think that's always like a key, factor in all of this. I mean, the client has to trust you, and the advice you're giving, and that's just in order to have that rapport with the client, and for you to advise them, and for them to be willing to be advised. There has to be trust in that, and I think that's where that's one of those major flags that if you can identify that a client doesn't have trust in you, then that's a client to probably either try to build trust somehow, maybe that's possible, or maybe part ways if there isn't the trust there, because without that you can't have this kind of conversation where you're both coming to an understanding and arriving at a solution together. If they don't trust you, then they're just going to be skeptical of the whole thing, and it just doesn't really work out.
Yeah, and you're going to have trouble getting the bill paid too.
Well, that too.
In many cases, it's not worth it. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So you mentioned your business show. Could you say the name of that again, Dave?
Yeah, it's called Business Brain at businessbrain.show. I've been doing that for a little over 7.5 years now with Shannon Jean, who is not a stranger to the Mac market. He ran 2 companies, which he has since sold. One was called Mac Rescue, and the other was Tech Restore. And that's how I met him, was because, we were all involved in the Apple industry together. But he's run a bunch of other businesses. We've run a couple together, and we talk about applying all of this sort of business logic to not only business, but other areas of our lives too. So that's Business Brain, businessbrain.show.
Nice. And that's another, blast from the past kind of reference for me. I think I bought some parts from Tech Restore, way back in the day, and definitely got the newsletters here. I have an email. If I search for Tech Restore, I have seen an email from Shannon Jean from January 2007. So it's
Shannon is the master, or at least, no, he still is the master at sourcing things. He is a deal guy. And he was able to buy, he would buy parts in bulk, like huge bulk, sometimes even from Apple themselves, and then would, get it and figure out which of the bulk was garbage and which of the bulk was good, and, sort it out. And that's how you could get Apple parts up until very recently, where their right to repair things started to open some of those doors for like 2 Apple devices or something, but we'll get there.
It's wild. It's been an interesting road in the world of Apple for sure. So in addition to, it's great to talk tech and talk about tech, but the other thing that I like from podcasts, is business, because of course we're all, in addition to doing the tech, we're also trying to run our businesses. So I think that's something we try to offer on our show. It's good to know you're out there with also a show focused on business. So that's another great one for our listeners. And where can our listeners find you just broadly on the internet, in addition to Mac Geek Gab and your other shows? Where should they look for you?
DaveHamilton.com will bring you to my website, which is, mostly ignored and a place to send you elsewhere. If you happen to be on Twitter, I am also at Dave Hamilton on Twitter. But yeah, DaveHamilton.com is as close as that works. No problem.
Awesome. Well, it's been awesome talking to you, Dave. It's been really fun kind of learning about some of the places where our paths probably intersected and were parallel for different points in time. And we certainly admire everything you're doing with Mac Geek Gab over all these years, and the other things you've been involved in the Apple ecosystem. So thanks for all your efforts and work. And we look forward to continuing to listen to Mac Geek Gab for those quick tips and at least 5 new things that we can learn every show that you do for 941 shows now.
Yeah, I'm already working on 942 because that's how it works.
That's how it works. Yep, on that hamster wheel.
Yeah, I hope on 942 we hear what happened to the TV that John had that had a mysterious accident.
I don't even know the answer to that yet. So I'm not sure I will ever get the answer to that. I have some speculation. But again, I've known John since I was 15. And so I have to remember that when sharing or not sharing publicly. So, yep, I'll just leave it at that. Yep.
Fair enough. We'll keep listening, see if we can get the inside scoop.
I will try my best to get him to share that. It's going to be John's decision as to whether he shares what happens to his TV.
Sam lives close enough, Dave, if you want him to do a drive-by someday just to check up on John.
I'm still in Norwalk, so.
Right.
All right. Okay. I mean, maybe we should get together the next time I'm down there visiting John.
For sure, man. I'm still holding down the fort in Norwalk. Everyone else left me, but I'm still here.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been great.
Command Control Power wouldn't exist without the support of our community. Special thanks to the following community members whose strong monthly support has sustained us for all these years. Ryan Gowdy, CoreCompetent.com. Weldon Dodd, Kanji.io. Richard Wingfield, EnvisionDesign.net. Adam Rice, AskAdam.io. Mac Admins Podcast, podcast.macadmins.org. Tim Nyberg, TheMacGuys.com. Michael Thompson, Origin84.com. Matthew Waples, Waples.net. Tom Puls, BoxIT.tech. Jerome Potters, PITPro.nl. Steve Sorbo, MacSOS.biz. Andy Espo, CallAndy.com. And Nate Sinal, WeAreAScout.com. Thank you all very much, and thanks to our patrons at every level of support. If you enjoy the show, we really would love your support. And if you already support us and can increase your monthly pledge, we really do find that encouraging. CommandControlPower.com and click support. Thanks very much for listening and for supporting the show.
Jerry does his voices of customers of all kinds.
Am I on the cloud?
Joe spins his deeply detailed yarns all the time.
I have a whole story about this.
Sam is on the road again, phoning in from a hotel.
At least we know where I am.
Half a century combined of Apple expertise right now. Right now. My Mac is slow. Have you tried restarting? Well, the fans won't blow. Have you tried restarting? But my data is gone. Have you tried restarting? I dropped it in the pond. Have you tried restarting? Well, my coffee is cold. Have you tried restarting? Well, I'm getting old. Have you tried restarting? I fell off a horse. Have you tried restarting? I'm getting a divorce. Have you tried restarting? Command, control, power, command, control,
Started out in Texas, and I think you even spent a little bit of time in Connecticut.
I actually grew up in Connecticut and then moved to Texas and then back to Connecticut for a short stint and now in New Hampshire.
The Connecticut angle would probably only be interesting to Sam and I and Joe.
One of you is in Norwalk, is that right? That's where I was born and raised.
Oh, really? Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so
Wild.
Joe and I are, well, Joe's like, who knows where Joe is these days? Where are you, Joe? You're in Colorado.
I'm in Boulder, Colorado. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But we're both Norwalk consultancies.
But yeah, I was born in Norwalk Hospital.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Norwalk Hospital? Really?
That's wild.
Yeah. I lived in Norwalk until I was 22, I want to say. 21 or 22, yeah. Half of my childhood was on the Westport border, and the other half was in Rowayton on the Darien border. So, kind of both sides of Norwalk there. Yeah.
Oh, man. Total Norwalk,
Yeah.
dude.
That's wild.
Totally.
I grew up in Westport technically, but like on the line of Norwalk. So I mean, it's pretty funny. And somehow we all ended up in tech podcasting. So
my mom still lives in the house that I grew up in on the Westport border. That's on Tyrone Drive. That street actually has some houses on Westport and some in Norwalk. So it's right. It's literally
I'm pretty
right
sure
there.
the street borders. I think you're my neighbor. I think your mom's my neighbor or my parents' neighbor anyway.
Yeah, right.
That's
right.
that's on William Street, I think, right? Or
Correct.
Tyrone Drive. I'm pretty sure it's like so it's like basically that street is like the backyard of my parents' house. Like so
Yeah.
it's that's for
Our parents are neighbors. There you go.
wild.
Yeah.
That's wild. Wow. Small world, It's really
Totally.
really wild.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm still in Norwalk. I'm still holding down the fort here in
Yeah.
Fairfield County. I don't know where Tyrone
Good
Drive is.
stuff.
I was just looking it up. Oh, I see it. Okay, I found it. Yeah, dude, you're right by Joe's house. Oh my god.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? That is wild.
A friend of mine lived on the other side of Tyrone, on the Westport side of Tyrone Drive, and we would walk through the back of his house with our go-karts and ride go-karts down Hogan Trail because it had that great hill.
Yeah. Nice. That's amazing. My dad probably went out on the porch and like shook his fist, you know.
Yeah, like stay off my lawn.
That's correct. That's right. Yeah, that's right. That's so awesome.
That's too funny. That's really awesome. Small world. Wow.
Really small world.
Really small world. Well, we should probably roll right into the show proper. I mean, some of this.